The story of the Goths, a people whose name would echo through centuries and across continents, begins not in the sun-drenched plains of the south, but in the colder, more enigmatic lands of Scandinavia, around the 1st century CE. Imagine a time when the northern seas were still largely untamed, their dark waters guarding secrets, and the land itself a tapestry of dense forests and rocky shores, cradled a people on the cusp of a monumental journey. These were the Goths, or at least the ancestors of those who would later bear that name, stirring from their ancestral homelands, perhaps driven by a yearning for richer soils, a growing population, or simply the irresistible pull of the unknown. Their earliest legends, dimly recalled through the mists of time, and recorded much later by Gothic historians like Jordanes in his 6th century work, the Getica, speak of a migration from an island called Skansa. While the precise location of this mythical Skansa remains a subject of scholarly debate, some point to the Swedish island of Gotland, others to the southern tip of the Scandinavian peninsula. The essence of the tale is clear. A people united by a shared identity and a chieftain named Berig set sail in 3 ships, venturing south across the Baltic Sea. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic flight, but likely a gradual, generational movement, the slow, deliberate expansion that would eventually reshape the face of Europe. The journey itself must have been arduous, a test of endurance and resolve. Imagine small, sturdy vessels, perhaps not unlike the Viking longships that would appear centuries later, laden with families, livestock, and all the worldly possessions they could carry. The biting winds, the unpredictable currents, the vast, unbroken expanse of the sea. These were the first challenges faced by a people destined to confront empires. Upon reaching the southern shores of the Baltic, likely somewhere along the Vistula River delta in modern-day Poland, they encountered new landscapes and new peoples. This initial landing marked the beginning of their long interaction with the wider world, a world far different from the isolated fjords and forests they had left behind. The archaeological record offers tantalizing glimpses into this early period, though it rarely speaks with the clarity of written history. The Veilbark culture, flourishing in the region of Pomerania and Mazovia from the 1st to the 4th centuries CE, is often associated with the early Goths and their immediate neighbours. Excavations have unearthed distinctive burial practices, such as inhumation rather than cremation, and the absence of weapons in graves, which stands in contrast to many other Germanic tribes of the era. This intriguing detail has led some historians to speculate about the Goths' early societal structure and their initial interactions with other groups. Were they less warlike in their nascent stages, perhaps more focused on agriculture and trade? Or did their burial customs simply reflect a different cultural emphasis, a reverence for the dead that prioritized adornment over martial display? The answer remains elusive, a whispered question carried on the ancient winds. As they settled in their new lands, the Goths began to differentiate themselves from the other Germanic tribes. Their name, Goths, itself is a subject of etymological debate. While Jordanes links it to Gothi, and some scholars connect it to Gutans or Gauta, a tribe mentioned in Norse sagas, the precise origin is less important than the identity it forged. They were not a monolithic entity, but a collection of related groups, often distinguished by their geographical location or their specific tribal affiliations. Over time, 2 major branches would emerge: the Visigoths, or Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths, though these distinctions would only solidify much later, after centuries of migration and interaction with the Roman Empire. The gradual southward. The movement continued, a slow, inexorable drift across the vast plains of Eastern Europe. This was not a single organized invasion, but rather a series of smaller migrations, driven by a combination of factors: the promise of fertile land, the pressure from other migrating tribes, and perhaps an innate wanderlust that characterized many Germanic peoples of the era. As they moved, they absorbed elements of the cultures they encountered, and in turn left their own indelible mark. Their presence in these lands is attested by Roman writers, who initially knew little of these distant northern peoples. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century CE, mentions the Gothanes as a powerful and warlike tribe living east of the Vistula, noting their distinctive round shields and short swords. This early Roman observation provides one of the first external glimpses of the Goths, painting a picture of a formidable people already making their presence felt on the fringes of the Roman world. The Goths' journey was not just a physical one. It was also a journey of transformation. From a relatively isolated group in Scandinavia, they were becoming a major player on the European stage. Their encounters with other Germanic tribes, with the nomadic Sarmatians and Alans of the steppes, and eventually with the mighty Roman Empire itself, would shape their language, their customs, and their very destiny. They learned new military tactics, adopted new technologies, and began to develop a more complex social structure. The simple tribal society of Skansa slowly gave way to a more stratified system, with powerful chieftains and a burgeoning warrior class. This period of early migration, stretching over several centuries, is perhaps the most mysterious chapter in Gothic history. The archaeological evidence is sparse and open to multiple interpretations, and the written sources are few and often biased. We are left to piece together their story from fragments. A distinctive brooch found in a grave, a fleeting mention in a Roman text, a half-remembered legend passed down through generations. Yet, even in this obscurity, we can discern the outlines of a people in motion, a people driven by an unseen force, moving ever closer to the heart of the Roman world. The journey south from Skansa was more than just a change of scenery. It was a profound cultural shift. The Goths, once a people of the forests and fjords, were becoming a people of the plains, adapting to new environments and new ways of life. Their initial settlements along the Vistula would serve as a staging ground for further expansion, pushing them ever closer to the fertile lands north of the Black Sea. This region, known to the Romans as Scythia, was a melting pot of cultures, a crossroads where east met west. Here, the Goths would encounter the rich agricultural lands of present-day Ukraine, a stark contrast to the harsher northern climes. The promise of abundance, of land capable of supporting a larger population, would have been a powerful draw. The movement was not always peaceful. As they advanced, they likely displacement and absorbed other smaller tribes, their growing strength allowing them to assert dominance. The Goths were not mere wanderers. They were a dynamic force, their migrations often accompanied by conflict and conquest. Yet, their interactions were not solely defined by warfare. They also engaged in trade, exchanging goods with their neighbours, learning new crafts, and integrating new ideas into their own culture. The amber routes, stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, would have been familiar pathways. connecting them to the wider world and its riches. As the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE unfolded, the Goths' presence in the regions north of the Black Sea became more pronounced. They were no longer a distant, vaguely understood people, but a tangible, growing power on the Roman frontier. Roman writers began to refer to them more frequently, often with a mixture of fear and fascination. The term Getae, an ancient Thracian people, was sometimes mistakenly applied to the Goths by classical authors, leading to some historical confusion that scholars still untangle today. This misidentification highlights the Roman tendency to lump various barbarian tribes together, often failing to grasp the nuanced distinctions between them. It also underscores the challenge of reconstructing the Goths' early history, as even contemporary accounts could be imprecise or based on limited information. The Goths' arrival in the Black Sea region marked a significant turning point. They were now in close proximity to the Roman Empire, separated only by the Danube River. This proximity would inevitably lead to conflict, but also to a complex relationship of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The vast steppes offered opportunities for raiding, but also for settlement and agriculture. The Goths, once a maritime people, were transforming into a formidable land-based power, their cavalry becoming a force to be reckoned with. The story of their early migrations is a testament to human resilience and adaptability. From a small group venturing across the sea, they grew into a confederation of tribes, their name striking fear into the hearts of emperors. Their journey was not a straight line, but a meandering path, shaped by geography, climate, and the interactions with countless other peoples. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, a gradual awakening to their own power and potential. The seeds of their future triumphs and tragedies were sown in these early movements, in the choices made by chieftains like Berig, and in the countless unnamed individuals who packed their lives into those 3 ships and set sail for the unknown. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, of a people who dared to leave their ancient homes and forge a new destiny, a destiny that would forever alter the course of European history. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. Our journey with the Goths now leads us to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea, a vast, shimmering expanse that would become both a gateway and a crucible for their burgeoning identity. Having traversed the sprawling plains and dense forests of Eastern Europe, their migrations, though still shrouded in the mists of pre-literate history, eventually brought them into direct, undeniable contact with the Roman Empire. This was no mere border skirmish, but the beginning of a complex, centuries-long dance, a tapestry woven with threads of trade, raiding, military confrontation, and eventually a profound cultural intermingling that would forever reshape the European continent. Imagine, if you will, the scene around the middle of the 3rd century CE. The Goths, or at least a significant portion of them, had settled in the fertile lands north of the Black Sea, in what is now modern-day Ukraine and Romania. Here, the great rivers like the Dniester and the Dnieper snaked their way to the sea, offering rich agricultural land and easy access to maritime routes. This was a land of rolling steppes, dense forests, and a surprisingly mild climate, a stark contrast to the harsher climes they might have left behind in Scandinavia or the Baltic coast. They were not a monolithic entity, but rather a collection of related groups often identified by Roman writers as the Tervingi and the Gruthungi, though these distinctions were sometimes fluid and perhaps more about geographical location than strict tribal identity. Their initial encounters with the Roman Empire were not always hostile. The Black Sea was a vibrant hub of commerce, dotted with Roman and Greek trading colonies like Olbia, Tyrus, and Chersonesus. For generations, Roman merchants had sailed these waters, exchanging goods with the various peoples of the hinterland. The Goths, with their growing numbers and organizational skills, quickly integrated themselves into this existing network. They traded furs, amber, timber, and perhaps even slaves for Roman luxury goods, wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and crucially, metalwork and weaponry. This period was characterized by a fascinating blend of cooperation and nascent tension, a delicate balance where the allure of Roman wealth was both a magnet for trade and a temptation for plunder. But the lure of Roman riches, combined with their own martial traditions, soon tipped the scales towards more aggressive interactions. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century was not the invincible colossus it had once been. It was a vast, sprawling entity, beset by internal strife, civil wars, and a succession of short-lived emperors. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, saw the empire stretched thin, its legions often engaged in fighting each other rather than defending the frontiers. This weakness was not lost on the Goths. Their first major incursions into Roman territory were not land-based, but rather audacious sea raids. Utilizing their shipbuilding skills, perhaps learned from the local populations or adapted from their own seafaring heritage, they constructed fleets of swift, shallow-draft boats. These vessels, probably similar to the longboats of later Viking raiders, allowed them to navigate the coastal waters and even the great rivers, bypassing heavily fortified land borders. Beginning around 238 CE, these Gothic fleets, often in alliance with other Germanic tribes and even local Sarmatian groups, launched devastating attacks on the Roman provinces of Moesia and Thrace, and even across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. Imagine the terror these raids must have inspired. Suddenly, from the seemingly tranquil sea, a swarm of longboats would appear, disgorging warriors onto unsuspecting coastal towns. The Goths were not just seeking plunder, they were testing the limits of Roman power and finding them surprisingly permeable. One of the most significant of these early raids occurred around 250 to 251 CE, when a large Gothic force, led by a chieftain named Cniva, crossed the Danube and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Abritus. This battle was a catastrophe for Rome, resulting in the death of Emperor Decius and his son, the first time a Roman emperor had been killed in battle against a foreign foe. The psychological impact of this defeat resonated throughout the empire, signaling a new and dangerous era. The Goths continued their maritime depredations throughout the 250s and 260s. They sacked cities like Chalcedon, Nicomedia, and even the wealthy metropolis of Ephesus, plundering temples, seizing treasure, and carrying off captives. These were not mere hit-and-run raids. Some were extensive campaigns, lasting for months, with the Goths establishing temporary bases and systematically pillaging vast swathes of territory. Historians still debate the precise motivations behind these extensive sea raids. Were they driven purely by a desire for plunder and resources, or was there a deeper strategic aim, perhaps to establish a more permanent presence in the rich Roman provinces? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a complex interplay of opportunity, necessity, and a growing awareness of Roman vulnerability. One lesser-known detail from this period concerns the fate of the Library of Alexandria, While it had already suffered damage over the centuries, some accounts suggest that a Gothic raid in 270 CE, though not directly targeting Alexandria, contributed to the destruction of significant cultural centers in Asia Minor, further diminishing the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. While the main library itself was likely long gone or severely diminished, cultural shockwaves of these raids undoubtedly impacted scholarly pursuits and the preservation of knowledge in the region. The Roman response to these persistent threats was, at first, largely ineffective. The empire was too preoccupied with internal power struggles and other barbarian incursions along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. However, a series of more capable emperors eventually emerged, determined to restore Roman prestige and secure its borders. Emperor Claudius Gothicus, whose very name reflects his victories, inflicted a major defeat on the Goths at the Battle of Nisus in 268 or 269 CE. This battle, though its details are somewhat obscure, is often seen as a turning point, temporarily breaking the back of Gothic power and forcing them to retreat north of the Danube. Following this, Emperor Aurelian, a formidable military commander, took further steps to stabilize the situation. Recognizing the difficulty of defending the exposed province of Dacia, modern-day Romania, which lay north of the Danube and was a frequent target for Gothic raids, he made the strategic decision to withdraw Roman legions and administration from the region around 271 CE. This was a momentous decision, a tacit acknowledgement that the empire could no longer hold every inch of its vast territory. Dacia, which had been a Roman province for over 150 years, was effectively ceded to the Goths and other barbarian groups, creating a new, albeit fluid, frontier along the Danube. This withdrawal, while seemingly a defeat, allowed the Romans to consolidate their defences along a more defensible natural barrier. For the Goths, it meant gaining control over a rich and strategically important territory. They now occupied lands that had once been part of the Roman Empire. Inheriting some of its infrastructure and encountering its former inhabitants, this period marked a significant shift from mere raiding to a more settled existence within a former Roman province. The Goths who settled in Dacia and the lands north of the Black Sea during this period became known to the Romans primarily as the Tervingi and the Greuthungi. The Tervingi, often associated with the forests, from the Gothic word trias, meaning tree, generally occupied the western parts of this territory, closer to the Danube. The Greuthungi, whose name might relate to the steppes or sandy shores, from Grut, meaning sand or gravel, were typically found further east, towards the Dnieper and the Crimean Peninsula. While these distinctions were meaningful at the time, they were not always rigid, and the groups often acted in concert. Life for the Goths in these new lands was a blend of their traditional ways and the influences of their Roman neighbours. They continued to practice agriculture, raising livestock and cultivating grains. Their settlements were often dispersed, consisting of small villages and farmsteads, though larger, more fortified centres also existed, particularly as they consolidated their power. Archaeology reveals a fascinating mix of Gothic material culture alongside Roman artefacts, indicating active trade and a growing adoption of Roman goods and even technologies. Pottery, jewellery, and weaponry from this period show a distinct Gothic style, yet often incorporate Roman motifs and techniques. Crucially, it was during this period that the Goths began to encounter Christianity. The Roman Empire, though still largely pagan, was home to a growing Christian population, particularly in the eastern provinces. Captives taken during raids, as well as missionaries, played a role in introducing the new faith to the Goths. The most famous figure in this religious transformation was Ulfilas, a Goth who became a bishop and, remarkably, translated the Bible into the Gothic language in the mid-4th century. To do this, he had to invent a Gothic alphabet, adapting Greek and Latin letters to suit the sounds of his native tongue. This monumental achievement not only provided the Goths with their own written language, but also profoundly shaped their cultural and religious identity. Ulfilas, however, preached Arian Christianity, a form of the faith that differed from the Nicene or Trinitarian Christianity that would eventually become the dominant orthodoxy of the Roman Empire. Arianism held that Jesus Christ was created by God the Father and was therefore subordinate to him, rather than co-eternal and co-equal. This theological distinction, seemingly subtle to modern ears, would have profound political and social consequences in the centuries to come, creating a religious divide between the Arian Goths and the Nicene Romans that often fueled mistrust and conflict. As the 4th century progressed, the relationship between the Goths and the Roman Empire continued to evolve. They were no longer just raiders from beyond the frontier. They were now powerful neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes adversaries. Roman emperors occasionally recruited Gothic warriors into their armies, offering them land and pay in exchange for their martial prowess. These foederati, or federated troops, became an increasingly important and sometimes problematic component of the Roman military machine. The Goths, for their part, were not isolated. They were part of a complex web of interactions with other Germanic tribes, as well as the remnants of the Sarmatians and other peoples of the Pontic steppe. Their society was becoming more stratified, with powerful chieftains and a warrior aristocracy emerging. They were learning the ways of the Roman world, not just through trade and conflict, but through direct observation and interaction. The Roman Empire, in turn, was learning to adapt to the presence of these formidable neighbors, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through force, and often through a grudging acceptance of their growing power. Yet, despite the periods of relative calm and coexistence, the underlying tension remained. The Goths, though increasingly settled, were still a mobile and expansionist people. The Roman Empire, though weakened, still represented immense wealth and prestige. The Black Sea, which had brought them together, remained a vital artery, connecting them to the wider world and to each other. The stage was set for even more dramatic events, for the arrival of new, terrifying forces from the east that would once again uproot the Goths and propel them into the heart of the Roman Empire, irrevocably altering the course of European history. The gentle lapping of the Black Sea waves against its shores whispered of battles yet to come, of empires yet to fall, and of a people whose journey was far from over. The Roman Empire, once a seemingly unshakable colossus, found itself increasingly beleaguered as the 3rd century dawned. A pervasive sense of unease, a gnawing anxiety, began to creep through its vast territories. This period, often termed the crisis of the 3rd century, was a tumultuous era, marked by rapid successions of emperors, some reigning for mere months, civil wars, economic instability, and relentless external pressures. It was against this backdrop of Roman vulnerability that the Gothic presence, previously a distant rumble, began to coalesce into a formidable and immediate threat. The Goths, having settled in the lands north of the Black Sea, particularly in what is now Ukraine and Romania, had by this point developed a more sophisticated social and military structure. They were no longer merely disparate tribes, but were coalescing into larger confederations, often identified by Roman writers as the Tervingi and the Griuthungi, though these distinctions were likely fluid and perhaps even Roman constructs to categorize a complex reality. Their proximity to the Roman frontier along the lower Danube meant that contact, both peaceful and hostile, became increasingly frequent. Trade routes, once conduits of prosperity, now also served as pathways for intelligence and ultimately for invasion. The first truly devastating Gothic incursions into Roman territory began in earnest around the middle of the 3rd century. These were not mere border skirmishes, but large-scale invasions, driven by a combination of factors: the lure of Roman wealth, the pressure of other migrating groups from the north, and the perceived weakness of the empire. One of the earliest and most impactful of these campaigns occurred in 250 AD, when a Gothic force, led by a chieftain named Caniva, crossed the Danube. This was a significant moment, not just for the scale of the invasion, but for the profound shock it delivered to the Roman psyche. Caniva's Goths were not easily repelled. They bypassed fortified cities, plundered the countryside, and inflicted a series of defeats on Roman legions. The climax of this particular campaign was the Battle of Abritus in 251 AD. This battle, fought in what is now northeastern Bulgaria, was a catastrophe for Rome. Not only were a significant number of Roman soldiers killed, but the emperor himself, Decius, along with his son Herennius Etruscus, perished in the fighting. This was an unprecedented event, the first time a Roman emperor had been killed in battle against a foreign foe. The news would have reverberated across the empire, a chilling testament to the growing power of these northern barbarians. The loss of an emperor in such a manner was more than a military defeat. It was a profound blow to Roman prestige and a stark indicator of the empire's precarious state. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that would have swept through the streets of Rome. The whispers of divine displeasure, the frantic efforts to stabilize a reeling government. Following this victory, the Goths continued to be a persistent menace. Their raids grew bolder, their targets more ambitious. They began to utilize naval power, constructing fleets of small, swift vessels to navigate the Black Sea and launch attacks on the wealthy Roman provinces of Asia Minor and Greece. These maritime raids, occurring in the 260s AD, were particularly disruptive. Cities like Ephesus, a jewel of Roman Asia, known for its magnificent Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were sacked. The Goths, along with allied tribes, plundered temples, looted treasuries, and carried off vast amounts of wealth and captives. The sheer audacity of these attacks, striking at the very heart of Roman civilization in the East, demonstrated a new level of strategic capability and ambition. The sack of Athens in 267 AD, though perhaps not as thoroughly devastating as some accounts suggest, certainly left its mark. The ancient city, once the great lull of philosophy and democracy, was ravaged. Libraries were burned, monuments defaced, and its inhabitants subjected to the horrors of war. While Roman forces eventually managed to drive the Goths out and rebuild parts of the city, the psychological impact of such an event was immense. It showed that even the most venerable and historically significant cities of the empire were not immune to barbarian depredations. The memory of these events would linger, a dark stain on the otherwise glorious tapestry of Roman history. These repeated incursions forced Rome to adapt, often through desperate measures. Emperors like Claudius Gothicus, who earned his epithet for his victories against the Goths, and Aurelian dedicated their reigns to restoring order and pushing back the barbarian tide. Claudius Gothicus achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Naissus in 268 AD, inflicting heavy casualties on a large Gothic force. This battle is often seen as a turning point, temporarily stemming the tide of Gothic invasions and earning Claudius the admiration of his contemporaries. Aurelian, a soldier emperor of immense energy and determination, further stabilized the empire, but even he recognized the need for strategic retrenchment. One of Aurelian's most controversial decisions, made around 271 AD, was the abandonment of Dacia. This province, located north of the Danube, had been conquered by Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, and was a symbol of Roman imperial expansion. However, its exposed position, surrounded by hostile tribes and increasingly difficult to defend, made it a drain on Roman resources. Aurelian, facing threats on multiple fronts, decided to withdraw Roman legions and administration, resettling the Romanized population south of the Danube. This was a pragmatic but painful decision, a tacit admission that the empire could no longer hold all its territories. It marked a significant shift in Roman policy, moving from expansion to consolidation, and it left a power vacuum in Dacia that would be filled by various barbarian groups, including the Goths, further solidifying their presence along the Roman frontier. The nature of the Gothic presence during this period is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Were they a unified people with a clear political agenda, or were they a loose confederation of warrior bands drawn together by the promise of plunder and the weakness of Rome? Historians still disagree on the precise ethnic makeup of these groups, and whether the term Goth, as used by Roman writers, accurately reflects a single, coherent identity. Some argue that Goth was a Roman umbrella term for various Germanic and Sarmatian groups operating in the region, while others maintain that a distinct Gothic identity was indeed emerging. The archaeological record, though rich in artifacts, offers tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers, leaving much to interpretation. What is clear, however, is that their military effectiveness and their ability to repeatedly challenge the Roman Empire were undeniable. The economic consequences of these Gothic incursions were severe. Cities were plundered, agricultural lands laid waste, and trade routes disrupted. The constant need to fund military campaigns, coupled with the loss of tax revenue from devastated provinces, put immense strain on the imperial treasury. This contributed to the rampant inflation and debasement of coinage that characterized the crisis of the 3rd century. Imagine a farmer toiling in the fields, constantly looking over his shoulder for signs of raiding parties, or a merchant wary of setting out on a journey, knowing that the roads might be unsafe. The sense of insecurity permeated daily life, fostering an atmosphere of anxiety and decline. Beyond the immediate destruction, the Gothic wars of the 3rd century had a profound and lasting impact on Roman military and defensive strategy. The empire, realizing the vulnerability of its vast borders, began to invest heavily in fortifications. The construction of new walls around cities, most notably the Aurelian walls around Rome itself, begun in 271 AD, was a stark visual reminder of the changed realities. For centuries, Rome had projected an image of invincibility, its heartland seemingly safe from foreign attack. Now, the capital itself needed a massive defensive perimeter, a testament to the new and terrifying threats that loomed. These walls, towering and imposing, were not just physical barriers, they were psychological ones, an attempt to restore a sense of security to a populace that had grown accustomed to fear. The interactions between Romans and Goths were not, however, solely defined by conflict. There were periods of uneasy peace, of diplomacy, and even of alliance. Roman emperors would sometimes recruit Gothic warriors into their own armies, a practice that offered both advantages and risks. These Gothic auxiliaries, known for their fierce fighting skills, could be invaluable on the battlefield, but their loyalty was often conditional, and their presence within Roman ranks could be a source of tension and distrust. This complex relationship, oscillating between bitter enmity and pragmatic cooperation, would continue to define the Roman Gothic dynamic for centuries to come. The Goths themselves were not static during this period. Their exposure to Roman culture, albeit often through the lens of warfare and plunder, began to influence their own development. They adopted some Roman military tactics, learned about Roman administration, and were exposed to Roman material culture. The wealth they acquired from their raids was not simply hoarded, it was sometimes integrated into their own societies, changing their material possessions and perhaps even their social structures. The lines between barbarian and civilized were never as clear-cut as Roman propaganda often portrayed them, and the interactions along the frontier were a dynamic process of mutual influence. The crisis of the 3rd century eventually gave way to a period of renewed stability under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine. They implemented sweeping reforms, reorganizing the empire's administration, military, and economy. Yet, the scars of the Gothic incursions remained. The memory of sacked cities, fallen emperors, and abandoned provinces lingered. The Goths had demonstrated that Rome was not invincible, that its borders could be breached, and that its heartland was vulnerable. This realization fundamentally altered the Roman worldview and set the stage for the even more dramatic confrontations that would occur in the centuries that followed. The Gothic pressure had, in a way, forced Rome to look inward, to consolidate, and to redefine its priorities. The empire, though seemingly revitalized, was now a different entity, more militarized, more centralized, and perpetually aware of the formidable threats lurking beyond its frontiers. The Goths, for their part, had established themselves as a major power in Eastern Europe, a force to be reckoned with, and their story was far from over. Their raids had not just reshaped the landscape of the Roman Empire, but had also, perhaps inadvertently, forged a stronger sense of identity and purpose among the Gothic peoples themselves, preparing them for their next act on the stage of history. The echoes of their war cries, the clatter of their weapons, and the burning of Roman cities were now woven into the very fabric of the late Roman world, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of even the most powerful empires. The winds of change, often cold and unforgiving, were now blowing with a gale force from the east, carrying with them the dust of distant steppes and the terrifying whispers of a new, formidable power. This was the era of the Huns, a nomadic people whose origins were shrouded in the vastness of Central Asia, their very name becoming synonymous with destruction and dread. Their arrival in Europe in the late 4th century CE was not a slow, creeping tide, but a sudden, violent deluge that reshaped the geopolitical landscape and sent shockwaves through the established order. For the Goths, particularly the Tervingi, who would soon be known to history as the Visigoths, the Hunnic advance was an existential threat unlike any they had ever faced. These were not the Romans, with their structured legions and predictable tactics. The Huns were a force of nature, swift and brutal, their horse archers a whirlwind of arrows and terror. They moved with an astonishing speed, their cavalry a blur across the plains, leaving devastation in their wake. Their impact on the Gothic peoples was immediate and devastating. The Ostrogoths, who had settled north of the Black Sea, were among the first to feel the full brunt of the Hunnic onslaught. Their king, Alaric, a figure of legendary stature in Gothic oral traditions, is said to have taken his own life rather than face the humiliation of defeat at the hands of these relentless invaders. While the exact circumstances of his death are debated, the fact remains that the Ostrogothic Confederation was shattered, many of its people subjugated and absorbed into the Hunnic war machine. This cataclysmic event sent a shiver of fear through the Tervingi, who watched from the western banks of the Dniester River as their Ostrogothic kin were overwhelmed. They knew with a chilling certainty that they would be next. With their backs to the river and the terrifying Huns at their heels, they looked west, towards the one power that might offer them sanctuary, the Roman Empire. It was a desperate gamble, a plea for refuge from a people they had so often warred against, yet it seemed their only hope for survival. In 376 CE, a vast multitude of Tervingi, led by their chieftains Fritigern and Alavivus, gathered on the northern bank of the Danube River, which marked the boundary of the Roman Empire. Their numbers were staggering, estimated to be in the tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, including not just warriors, but women, children, and the elderly, all carrying their meager possessions. They sent envoys across the river to the Roman Emperor Valens, who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople. Their message was simple, yet profound. They sought permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory, promising to serve as allies and soldiers in exchange for land and protection. Valens, a cautious and pragmatic emperor, faced a momentous decision. Granting such a large, armed population entry into the empire was unprecedented and fraught with peril. Yet he also saw an opportunity. The empire was perennially short of manpower, and these Goths, renowned for their martial prowess, could be a formidable addition to his legions, a buffer against future barbarian incursions, and a source of much-needed tax revenue. After much deliberation, he agreed, but with a crucial condition. The Goths were to surrender their weapons upon crossing the river. This was a standard Roman practice when admitting barbarian groups, intended to prevent any potential uprising. However, the execution of this agreement was tragically flawed, a testament to the corruption and short-sightedness that often plagued the late Roman administration. The Roman officials tasked with overseeing the crossing, particularly a man named Lupicinus, were notoriously avaricious. Instead of ensuring the Goths were disarmed, they allowed many to keep their weapons in exchange for bribes, often in the form of slaves' estoc, or even sexual favors. This act of blatant corruption sowed the seeds of distrust and resentment from the very beginning. The crossing itself was a logistical nightmare. The sheer number of people, the chaos, and the inadequacy of Roman resources meant that many Goths suffered terribly. They were crammed into temporary camps, provided with insufficient food, and exploited mercilessly by Roman officials who hoarded supplies and sold them at exorbitant prices. The Goths, accustomed to a life of relative freedom and self-sufficiency, found themselves in a state of near starvation and humiliation. They were forced to trade their children into slavery for dog meat, a truly desperate measure that speaks volumes about their plight. This period, often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, is crucial for understanding the deep-seated bitterness that would soon erupt. Imagine the despair of a parent forced to sell their child for a scrap of food, all while Roman officials grew rich on their suffering. It was a betrayal of the highest order, turning the promise of refuge into a living hell. The simmering resentment eventually boiled over. When Fritigern and Alaric were invited to a banquet by Lupicinus in Marcianopolis, a Roman city, their warriors, starving and desperate, began to riot outside the city walls. Lupicinus, fearing for his life, attempted to seize the Gothic leaders. Alaric was likely killed, but Fritigern managed to escape, rallying his people to open rebellion. The Goths, many still armed, now had nothing left to lose. Their plea for refuge had turned into a fight for survival against their supposed protectors. What followed was a brutal and devastating war across the Thracian plains. The Goths, now joined by other disgruntled groups, including some Huns and Alans who had also crossed the Danube, moved through the Roman provinces, plundering and pillaging to sustain themselves. They were no longer seeking a home. They were seeking vengeance and resources. Roman attempts to suppress the uprising were met with fierce resistance. The Goths, fighting for their very existence, proved to be formidable adversaries. Emperor Valens, recognizing the gravity of the situation, began to move his army from the east, where he had been campaigning against the Sasanian Persians, towards Thrace. He also requested assistance from his nephew, the Western Roman Emperor Gratian, who was engaged in campaigns in Gaul. Gratian dispatched a contingent of his forces, but they were delayed. Valens, eager for a decisive victory, and perhaps unwilling to share the glory with his young nephew, decided to engage the Goths before Gratian's full forces could arrive. This decision would prove to be one of the most catastrophic in Roman history. On August 9th, 378 CE, the Roman army under Emperor Valens met the Gothic forces led by Fritigern, near the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne in Turkey. The battle was a brutal, chaotic affair fought under the scorching summer sun. Valens, perhaps underestimating the Goths' strength or overestimating his own, marched his exhausted troops for miles before engaging. The Roman army, estimated to be around 15,000 to 20,000 men, was a mix of veteran legions and auxiliary units. The Goths, while perhaps numerically superior, were a less disciplined force, composed of various tribal groups. However, their cavalry, particularly the Gothic heavy cavalry, played a crucial role. Historians still debate the exact tactics employed by Fritigern, but it seems he cleverly used the terrain and the element of surprise. While the Roman infantry advanced, the Gothic cavalry, which had initially been absent, suddenly appeared, having been foraging or deliberately held back, and launched a devastating flank attack. The Roman lines, already tired and perhaps disorganized, collapsed under the combined pressure. The battle quickly devolved into a rout. Thousands of Roman soldiers were cut down as they tried to flee. Emperor Valens himself was among the fallen, a rare and deeply shocking event for a Roman emperor to die in battle against barbarians. The exact circumstances of his death remain a mystery. Some accounts claim he was wounded and carried to a hut that was then set ablaze, while others suggest he simply disappeared in the chaos. Regardless, his body was never recovered, adding to the mystique and horror of the defeat. The Battle of Adrianople was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow that reverberated throughout the Roman world. It demonstrated in the most brutal fashion that the empire was no longer invincible, and that barbarian forces, when united and desperate, could not only defeat but utterly destroy a Roman army and kill an emperor. It marked a turning point, signaling a shift in the balance of power between Rome and the Germanic peoples. The Goths, who had sought refuge, had now become the masters of the battlefield, and their presence within the empire was no longer a matter of negotiation, but a stark reality. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople was one of chaos and devastation. The victorious Goths, emboldened by their triumph, continued to ravage the Thracian provinces, though they lacked the siege equipment to take fortified cities like Constantinople. The Roman Empire, reeling from the loss of an emperor and a significant portion of its eastern army, was in a state of crisis. It fell to Theodosius I, who was appointed Eastern Roman Emperor by Gratian in 379 CE, to pick up the pieces. Theodosius, a skilled general and diplomat, understood that a purely military solution against the Goths was no longer feasible. He embarked on a strategy of attrition, avoiding direct confrontation while slowly rebuilding the Roman army. More importantly, he adopted a policy of negotiation and integration. In 382 CE, Theodosius concluded a treaty with the Goths. This treaty was groundbreaking and controversial. Instead of expelling them or settling them as individual farmers, Theodosius allowed the Tervingi, now firmly established as the Visigoths, Western Goths, to settle within the empire as a distinct federated people, or foederati. They were granted land in Thrace, allowed to maintain their own leaders and laws, and were expected to provide military service to the empire. Crucially, they were not fully integrated into the Roman army as individual recruits, but fought under their own commanders as a distinct unit. This was a radical departure from traditional Roman policy. For the first time, a large, armed barbarian group was permitted to live within the empire's borders as an autonomous entity. While Theodosius saw this as a pragmatic solution to a seemingly intractable problem, many Romans viewed it with deep suspicion and resentment. They feared that these Goths, who had so recently been their enemies, would remain a dangerous state within a state, a potential fifth column. And indeed, this unique arrangement would lay the groundwork for future conflicts and ultimately contribute to the unraveling of the Western Roman Empire. Theodosius's reign, though marked by this controversial treaty, brought a period of relative stability. He successfully managed to incorporate many Goths into his army, even using them in his own civil wars against usurpers in the West. He was a complex figure, sometimes called the Great, who also made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Upon his death in 395 CE, the empire was once again divided between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, a division that would become permanent. With Theodosius, the strong hand that had kept the Goths in check was gone. The Visigoths, under a new and ambitious leader named Alaric, began to grow restless. The Treaty of 382 CE, while offering land, had not fully satisfied their aspirations. They felt they were not receiving the recognition or the payments they deserved for their mill. Iterary service. The Roman officials, particularly in the Western Empire, often treated them with disdain, withholding promised provisions and honours. This renewed sense of grievance, coupled with the weakness of the new emperors, set the stage for the next dramatic chapter in the Gothic saga, the relentless campaigns of Alaric that would culminate in the unthinkable. The story of the Visigoths, from their flight before the Huns to their settlement within the Roman Empire, is a testament to the complex interplay of fear, desperation, corruption, and military might. It highlights how a desperate plea for sanctuary could, through a series of tragic missteps and betrayals, escalate into a full-blown war that shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. The Battle of Adrianople stands as a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires are vulnerable when faced with a combination of external pressure and internal decay. And for the Goths, it was a pivotal moment, transforming them from refugees into a formidable power, forever altering the course of European history. Their journey from the banks of the Danube to the heart of the Roman Empire was far from over. Indeed, it was just beginning to gather momentum, carrying them towards destinies none could yet foresee. The chill winds of the late 4th century carried more than just the promise of winter. They whispered of change, of an empire's slow, agonizing breath. For the Goths, now a formidable and often fractious presence within the Roman Empire, the promise of stability had proven elusive. After the crushing defeat at Adrianople, the Romans, under Emperor Theodosius I, had tried a new approach. Instead of outright war, they offered settlement. Many Goths, particularly the Tuvingi, who had suffered so much, were granted lands within the empire, primarily in the Balkans, in exchange for military service. They were federates, technically allies, but their presence was a constant reminder of Roman vulnerability. This arrangement, while seemingly pragmatic, sowed seeds of resentment on both sides. Romans viewed the Goths with suspicion, as barbarians barely tamed, while the Goths felt exploited, their service undervalued, their promised provisions often withheld. It was into this simmering cauldron of mistrust and unfulfilled promises that Alaric emerged. Born around 370 AD, likely in the region of modern-day Bulgaria, he was a Visigoth, a leader who would forever etch his name into the annals of history. His early life is shrouded in the mists of time, but he rose to prominence as a commander of Gothic federates serving the Roman Empire. He fought alongside Theodosius I against the usurper Eugenius at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394 AD. A brutal clash where many Gothic warriors perished in the front lines, their lives seemingly expendable in Roman eyes. This experience, witnessing his people sacrificed for Roman ambition, must have deeply shaped Alaric's worldview, fueling a growing sense of injustice and a desire for a more secure future for his people. When Theodosius I died in 395 AD, the empire was formally divided between his two young and largely ineffectual sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. With Theodosius, the last strong emperor, gone, the fragile peace shattered. Alaric, feeling that the Visigoths had not received their due rewards for their service, and sensing the weakness at the heart of the empire, was proclaimed king by his people. This was a pivotal moment. The Goths were no longer merely federates. They were now a unified force under a single ambitious leader, demanding recognition and a homeland. Alaric's initial campaigns were not aimed at destroying Rome, but at securing a permanent, prosperous settlement for his people. He led his Visigoths through the Balkans, a region that had become a familiar battleground. They ravaged Thrace and Macedonia, their movements a desperate search for security and sustenance. The Eastern Roman Empire, under the influence of powerful court officials, proved unwilling or unable to confront Alaric directly. Instead, they often resorted to diplomatic maneuvering, attempting to divert the Visigoths towards the Western Empire, a strategy that only postponed the inevitable. In 397 AD, Alaric turned his attention to Greece. The ancient land, still revered for its classical past, was not spared. The Visigoths swept through Boeotia and Attica, their presence striking fear into the hearts of the populace. They famously sacked the city of Athens, though accounts suggest Alaric treated the city with a degree of reverence, perhaps swayed by its historical significance. The famed general Stilicho, a Vandal by birth, but a loyal and brilliant commander of the Western Roman Empire, attempted to corner Alaric in the Peloponnese. However, Alaric, demonstrating his strategic cunning, managed to slip through Stilicho's grasp, crossing the Gulf of Corinth and escaping into Epirus. This cat-and-mouse game between Alaric and Stilicho would define much of the next decade, a testament to the military prowess of both men. The Eastern Roman Empire, still hoping to rid themselves of the Visigothic problem, then appointed Alaric as Magister Militum per Illyricum, commander of the Roman foe. Vorsis in Illyricum. This was a remarkable concession, effectively giving Alaric official Roman authority and a legitimate base of operations. From this position, he could rearm and resupply his people, preparing for what would come next. Historians still debate the true motivations behind this appointment. Was it a desperate attempt to co-opt Alaric, to turn him into a Roman general? Or was it a cynical move by the Eastern court to strengthen him against the West? Seeing the two halves of the empire as rivals rather than allies, the truth likely lies in a complex mix of these factors, reflecting the deep divisions within the Roman leadership. With his position in Illyricum secured, Alaric, now a Roman general in name, began to look west. The fertile plains of Italy beckoned, a land of greater wealth and perhaps a more permanent home for his people. In 400 AD, Alaric led his Visigoths across the Julian Alps and into northern Italy. This was the first time in over a century that a hostile foreign army had penetrated Italy itself, a psychological blow to an empire that prided itself on its invincibility. Emperor Honorius, a weak and indecisive ruler, retreated to the fortified city of Ravenna, leaving Stilicho to defend the heartland of the empire. Stilicho, once again, proved to be Rome's most capable defender. He gathered what forces he could, including legions from Britain and the Rhine frontier, dangerously weakening those distant provinces. In 402 AD, at the Battle of Pollentia, Stilicho engaged Alaric's forces. It was a hard-fought battle, with both sides claiming victory. While the Visigoths suffered heavy losses and Alaric's camp was plundered, he managed to escape with the bulk of his army. A few months later, at Verona, Stilicho again confronted Alaric, inflicting another defeat. These battles, though not decisive in destroying Alaric's army, forced him to withdraw from Italy, at least for a time. For a few years, there was a tense lull. Alaric remained a threat, but he was outside Italy. However, the political machinations within the Roman court were far more dangerous than any external enemy. Stilicho, a man of immense power and influence, had many enemies who resented his Vandalic heritage and his perceived ambition. He was accused of colluding with Alaric, of secretly desiring to place his own son on the imperial throne, or even of wanting to make himself emperor. These accusations, fueled by jealousy and xenophobia, ultimately led to his downfall. In 408 AD, Emperor Honorius, swayed by his advisors, ordered Stilicho's execution. This was a catastrophic mistake, robbing the Western Roman Empire of its most brilliant general and its last effective defender. With Stilicho gone, the path to Rome lay open. Alaric, who had been negotiating with Stilicho for a new settlement and payment, saw his opportunity. The Roman government, now led by incompetent and anti-Gothic officials, repudiated all agreements. The Visigoths, who had been promised lands and gold, were once again left in limbo, their patience exhausted. In late 408 AD, Alaric led his Visigoths back into Italy, this time with a clear objective: Rome. The city of Rome. Though no longer the political capital of the Western Empire, that honour had fallen to Ravenna, remained its symbolic heart, a beacon of power and civilization. Its walls, built by Aurelian in the 3rd century, were formidable, but the city itself was unprepared for a siege. Alaric's army surrounded Rome, cutting off its supplies. The proud city, accustomed to drawing sustenance from across the empire, slowly began to starve. The accounts of the siege are harrowing. Rats and even human flesh were consumed as hunger gnawed at the inhabitants. The Roman Senate, desperate, tried to negotiate, offering a paltry sum for Alaric to lift the siege. Alaric's famous reply was a chilling testament to his demands. All the gold and silver that you possess, all your valuable movables, and all the slaves, this. Atter among you. When asked what he would leave them, he replied, your lives. After prolonged negotiations and the payment of a massive ransom, £5,000 of gold, £30,000 of silver, 4,000 silken tunics, 3,000 hides dyed scarlet, and £3,000 of pepper, Alaric temporarily lifted the siege. He then tried to negotiate a permanent settlement with Emperor Honorius in Ravenna, demanding land in Noricum, modern-day Austria, and an annual tribute. Honorius, however, remained obstinate, clinging to the illusion of Roman supremacy. He refused to grant Alaric a significant territory within the empire, fearing it would set a dangerous precedent. Alaric, frustrated by Honorius's intransigence, marched on Rome again in 409 AD. This time, instead of besieging the city, he seized the port of Ostia, Rome's lifeline for grain. With the city once again facing starvation, the Senate, under Alaric's influence, proclaimed a new emperor, Priscus Attalus, a Roman senator who was more amenable to the Goths' demands. Attalus, however, proved to be a weak and ineffective puppet. His reign was short-lived, as he failed to deliver on his promises to Alaric and alienated many Romans. Alaric, realizing his mistake, publicly stripped Attalus of his imperial regalia in 410 AD. The final act was now set. After years of negotiation, siege, and political maneuvering, Alaric's patience had run out. On August 24, 410 AD, the Visigoths entered Rome through the Salarian Gate, either through treachery or by overwhelming force. The exact circumstances of the gate's opening remain a point of scholarly debate. Some accounts suggest that slaves, sympathetic to the Goths or simply desperate for freedom, opened the gates from within. Others point to a more direct assault. Regardless of how they entered, the Visigoths were inside the Eternal City. The sack of Rome lasted for 3 days. While the popular image is one of utter devastation and wanton destruction, Historical accounts suggest a more nuanced reality. Alaric, a Christian himself, though an Arian Christian considered heretical by the Nicene Romans, ordered his troops to respect the churches, particularly St. Peter's Basilica and the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, which served as sanctuaries. Many Romans found refuge within these sacred spaces. However, the city was plundered. Wealth accumulated over centuries was seized. Houses were ransacked, valuables carried away, and many citizens were taken captive. Yet, compared to later sacks of Rome, particularly by the Vandals in 455 AD, the Visigothic sack was relatively restrained. There was no widespread slaughter, no systematic burning of buildings. The libraries, for example, were largely untouched. Nevertheless, the psychological impact was immense. For over 800 years, Rome had not been successfully invaded and sacked by a foreign enemy. The city that had conquered the world was now itself conquered. The news reverberated across the empire and beyond. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, famously lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The sack of Rome was not the end of the Western Roman Empire. That would come much later, in 476 AD, but it was a profound turning point, a clear signal that the old order was crumbling. It shattered the myth of Roman invincibility and demonstrated the fragility of an empire beset by internal strife and external pressures. After the sack, Alaric led his Visigoths south, perhaps intending to cross into Africa, the granary of the empire, to establish a permanent homeland there. However, fate intervened. In late 410 AD, Alaric died suddenly, likely from illness, in Consentia, modern-day Cosenza, in southern Italy. His death was as mysterious as his life was dramatic. According to the Gothic historian Jordanes, his followers diverted the Busento River, buried Alaric and his treasures in its bed, and then restored the river to its course, killing the labourers to keep the lure, the place of his grave a secret forever. This romantic, almost mythical burial ensured that the great Visigothic king would rest undisturbed, his final resting place a secret whispered only to the river's flow. Alaric's successor was his brother-in-law, Ataulf. With Alaric gone, the Visigoths were still a powerful force, but their immediate goals shifted. Ataulf, a more politically astute leader, recognized that a permanent settlement within the Roman Empire was the only viable path. He initially continued to move through Italy, but eventually led his people out of the peninsula and into Gaul, modern-day France, in 412 AD. Here, the Visigoths would eventually establish their own kingdom, a significant step in the transformation of the Roman West into a mosaic of Germanic successor states. The legacy of Alaric and the sack of Rome is complex. For the Romans, it was a moment of profound humiliation and despair, a symbol of their empire's decline. For the Goths, it was a desperate act born of necessity, a culmination of years of broken promises and a search for a secure future. Alaric himself remains a figure of enduring fascination. Was he a barbarian king driven by greed and ambition, or a leader fighting for the survival and dignity of his people? Perhaps he was both. His actions undeniably hastened the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, yet he also laid the groundwork for the emergence of new political entities in Europe, entities that would eventually evolve into the nations we know today. The events of these years, from the death of Theodosius to the sack of Rome, illustrate a crucial period of transition. The Roman Empire, once a monolithic power, was slowly dissolving, not in a single cataclysmic event, but through a series of pressures, internal weaknesses, and external challenges. The Goths, once merely a tribal group on the fringes, had become a central player, their destiny intertwined with that of Rome. The fall of Rome to Alaric was not the end of the world, but it was the end of an era, a stark reminder that even the mightiest empires are not eternal, and that the currents of history are constantly shifting, carrying old powers away and bringing new ones to the fore. The whispers of change that began with the chill winds of the late 4th century had now grown into a roar, echoing across the ancient world and forever altering its landscape. The rumble of hooves and the glint of steel had, for a time, subsided, replaced by the rustle of parchment and the murmur of new laws being forged. After the tumultuous decades of migration and plunder, a semblance of order began to take root for the Visigoths, not in the sun-baked fields of Italy, but in the fertile lands of Gaul. It was here, in the early 5th century, that they would establish a kingdom that, for a time, rivaled the waning power of Rome itself. The year 418 CE marks a pivotal moment. The Visigoths, under their king Wallia, entered into a foedus, a treaty, with the Roman Emperor Honorius. This was not a capitulation, but a strategic alliance, born of mutual necessity. Rome, increasingly stretched thin, granted the Visigoths lands in Aquitaine, a rich province in southwestern Gaul, ostensibly as federates, allies who would defend the empire against other barbarian incursions. This was a complex arrangement, a delicate dance between sovereignty and subordination. The Visigoths were meant to be guests, yet they quickly became masters. Toulouse, a city of ancient Roman origin, with its red brick buildings and winding Garonne River, became the heart of their new domain. Imagine the scene. Roman villas, once the exclusive preserve of senatorial elites, now housed Visigothic chieftains, their families, and their retinues. The Latin tongue, though still spoken by the indigenous Gallo-Roman population, began to mingle with the guttural sounds of Gothic, creating a linguistic tapestry that reflected the shifting power dynamics. This period, often referred to as the Visigothic Kingdom of Toulouse, was not a simple conquest, but a gradual, often uneasy integration. The Visigothic kings, particularly those who followed Wallia, such as Theodoric I and Alaric, understood the need for both military strength and administrative sophistication. They were no longer mere raiders, they were rulers. Theodoric I, who reigned from 418 to 451 CE, proved to be a shrewd statesman. He continued to play the Roman game, fighting alongside them against Attila's Huns at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE, where he famously fell in battle. This was a testament to the intricate web of alliances and enmities that characterized the late Roman world. A Gothic king dying in battle for Rome. It was a paradox that underscored the fluidity of identity and loyalty in an age of profound change. Yet, even as they fought for Rome, the Visigoths steadily expanded their own power. The foedus of 418 CE, initially a grant of land, was interpreted by the Visigoths as a license to expand. They pushed south into Hispania, battling the Suebi and Vandals, and east into other parts of Gaul, slowly but surely carving out an independent realm. The reign of Alaric, from 466 to 484 CE, marked the zenith of the Visigothic Kingdom of Toulouse. Alaric was a formidable figure, a king who dared to openly challenge Roman authority. He systematically seized Roman territories, ignoring treaties and imperial decrees. By the time of his death, the Visigothic kingdom stretched from the Loire River in the north to the Strait of Gibraltar in the south, encompassing much of modern-day France and Spain. Ulric's ambition was not merely territorial. He also sought to establish a distinct legal and administrative framework for his kingdom. He commissioned the Codex Euritianus, a collection of laws that, while drawing on Roman legal traditions, also incorporated Gothic customs and practices. This was a crucial step in forging a new identity for the Visigoths, moving them beyond their role as Roman federates and establishing them as legitimate rulers. The Codex Euritianus is a fascinating document, reflecting the complex interplay of cultures. It addressed issues ranging from land ownership and inheritance to criminal justice, demonstrating a sophisticated approach to governance. It also solidified the Visigothic king's authority, asserting their right to legislate independently of Rome. One of the lesser-known but significant aspects of the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse was its religious landscape. The Visigoths were Arian Christians, a theological branch that differed from the Nicene or Catholic Christianity of the Gallo-Roman population. This religious divide was a constant source of tension and, at times, open conflict. While some Visigothic kings, like Theodoric I, pursued a policy of relative tolerance, others, like Alaric, were more assertive in promoting Arianism. Imagine the quiet unease in a Gallo-Roman village as an Arian bishop arrived, or the hushed conversations among the local clergy about the theological differences that separated them from their new rulers. This religious schism was not just a matter of doctrine, it was a powerful marker of identity, reinforcing the cultural distinctions between the conquerors and the conquered. The scholarly dispute surrounding the nature of the Foedus of 418 CE is particularly illuminating. Historians still debate whether it was a genuine grant of land or a more coercive arrangement, essentially a forced settlement. Some argue that Rome, in its weakened state, had little choice but to accommodate the Visigoths, offering them land in exchange for their military service. Others contend that the Visigoths, having already demonstrated their capacity for destruction, simply took what they wanted, with the treaty serving as a convenient legal fiction to legitimize their presence. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, a testament to the messy realities of power politics in a collapsing empire. The ambiguity of the Foedus allowed both sides to interpret it to their advantage, leading to centuries of shifting alliances and conflicts. The Visigothic kings of Toulouse, despite their military prowess and administrative innovations, faced a constant challenge, maintaining control over a diverse and often restive population. The Gallo-Roman aristocracy, though initially stripped of much of its power, retained significant cultural influence and landholdings. The Visigoths, though numerically smaller, held the reins of military and political authority. This dynamic created a fascinating social structure where Roman traditions coexisted, often uneasily, with Gothic customs. Imagine the grand Roman villas still standing, but now hosting feasts where Gothic warriors in their distinctive attire mingled with Roman senators in their togas, perhaps conversing in a mixture of Latin and Gothic, or through interpreters. The legacy of the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse is profound, for it played a crucial role in the shaping of early medieval Europe. It was one of the first truly independent barbarian kingdoms to emerge on Roman soil, demonstrating that a new political order was possible beyond the crumbling edifice of the Western Roman Empire. The Visigoths, through their legal codes and administrative structures, laid some of the foundations for the future states of France and Spain. Their efforts to integrate Roman and Gothic elements, however imperfect, foreshadowed the syncretic cultures that would define the medieval period. However, the kingdom's eventual demise in Gaul was as dramatic as its rise. The Visigoths' expansionist policies and their Arian faith ultimately brought them into conflict with another rising power, the Franks, led by their ambitious king, Clovis. Clovis, a Nicene Christian, skillfully exploited the religious divide between the Visigoths and the Gallo-Roman population, positioning himself as a liberator of the Catholic faithful. The decisive confrontation came in 507 CE at the Battle of Vouillé. This was a clash of titans, a battle that would forever alter the map of Western Europe. The Visigothic king Alaric II, Euric's son, was defeated and killed by Clovis himself, marking a catastrophic blow to Visigothic power in Gaul. The defeat at Vouillé was a turning point. The Visigoths were largely driven out of Gaul. Their grand kingdom of Toulouse dismantled. They retreated south across the Pyrenees, consolidating their remaining territories in Hispania. This forced migration, though devastating, was not the end of their story. It marked a new chapter, where the Visigoths would establish an even more enduring kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. But the memory of Toulouse, of that brief, glorious period when a Gothic people ruled a significant portion of Gaul, lingered. It was a testament to their adaptability, their ambition, and their capacity to forge a new identity in the twilight of the Roman world. The ruins of Roman cities in Aquitaine, the echoes of Gothic names in local place names, and the fragments of the Codex Euricianus all whisper stories of this fascinating era. Perhaps the ancient stones of Toulouse, baked by the southern sun, still hold the faint imprint of Visigothic footsteps. A reminder of the time when a nomadic people, once feared as destroyers, transformed themselves into rulers, laying the groundwork for a new European order. Their kingdom, though ultimately fleeting in Gaul, was a crucial bridge between the classical world and the medieval, a testament to the enduring human capacity for adaptation and reinvention in the face of profound historical upheaval. The shifting sands of power, the clash of cultures, and the forging of new identities, these were the hallmarks of the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, a vibrant, complex chapter in the grand narrative of the Goths. The twilight of the Western Roman Empire cast long, fractured shadows across the European landscape, and within these deepening shades, new lights began to flicker, some brilliant, some fleeting. Among the most radiant was the star of Theodoric, a king whose ambition was as vast as the plains his ancestors once roamed, and whose vision sought to weave a new tapestry from the frayed threads of Roman grandeur and the vibrant, if sometimes coarse, strands of Gothic strength. His story begins not in the sun-drenched fields of Italy, but in the gilded cages of Constantinople, where, as a young boy, he was sent as a hostage. This practice, common in the late Roman world, served as a precarious peace treaty, a human bond meant to ensure the loyalty of powerful barbarian federations. Theodoric, born around 454 CE into the Amal dynasty, the noblest lineage of the Ostrogoths, spent a decade of his formative years. From roughly 461 to 471 CE, in the sophisticated, often treacherous, court of the Eastern Roman emperors. Here, amidst the marble halls and the intricate political dances, he absorbed the language, the customs, and the administrative complexities of the Roman world. He witnessed firsthand the power of its institutions, the allure of its culture, and perhaps, too, the subtle weaknesses that gnawed at its foundations. This period was not merely an exile, it was an education, shaping a barbarian prince into a leader capable of understanding and eventually governing a Romanized populace. Upon his return to his people, Theodoric found a world in flux. The Western Empire, in its death throes, had seen a succession of puppet emperors and increasingly powerful Germanic warlords. Odoacer, a Skyrrian chieftain, had deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE, an event often cited as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer, however, did not claim the imperial purple for himself. Instead, he styled himself as King of Italy, ruling from Ravenna, and nominally acknowledged the authority of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. For a time, Odoacer's reign brought a semblance of stability to the peninsula, but it was a stability built on shifting sands. The Eastern Emperor Zeno, ever watchful of the West, grew increasingly wary of Odoacer's independent power. He saw in Theodoric a potential counterweight, a powerful barbarian king who might be directed to remove another. And so, in 488 CE, Zeno bestowed upon Theodoric a commission: march into Italy, defeat Odoacer, and reclaim the peninsula for Roman authority, or at least for a Gothic king who would acknowledge Constantinople's suzerainty. It was a classic Byzantine maneuver, pitting one barbarian against another, hoping both would be weakened in the process. Theodoric, leading his entire people, men, women, and children, along with their livestock and possessions, embarked on a monumental journey across the Alps and into Italy. This was no mere military expedition. It was a migration, a nation on the move, seeking a new home. The war that followed was brutal and protracted, lasting nearly 5 years. The Ostrogoths, hardened by generations of wandering and warfare, proved formidable. Odoacer's forces, though well entrenched, were eventually outmaneuvered and defeated in a series of battles, most notably at the Isonzo and the Adige rivers. By 493 CE, Odoacer was besieged in Ravenna, his capital. The siege dragged on, a testament to Ravenna's formidable defences, surrounded by marshes and accessible only by causeways. Eventually, with both sides exhausted and facing starvation, a peace treaty was brokered, mediated by the local bishop. It stipulated that Theodoric and Odoacer would rule Italy jointly. This arrangement, however, was short-lived. A few days after Odoacer opened the gates of Ravenna, during a banquet meant to celebrate their newfound partnership, Theodoric, with his own hand, murdered Odoacer. The details remain murky. Some echo, suggest a premeditated act, others a sudden outburst of fury. Regardless, with Odoacer dead, Theodoric became the undisputed ruler of Italy. Theodoric's reign from 493 to 526 CE marked a unique and largely prosperous chapter in Italian history. He understood that to govern effectively, he could not simply impose Gothic rule on a Roman populace. His vision was one of coexistence, of a symbiosis between two distinct cultures. He famously declared, "An Goth, a Roman, lives well only through the Roman law." He sought to preserve Roman institutions, administration, and culture, while simultaneously upholding Gothic traditions and military strength. This policy of separation in unity was meticulously implemented. The Goths, though a minority, formed the military backbone of the kingdom. They were granted lands, often a third of the estates in Italy. But these lands were not violently seized, rather, They were often allotted through existing Roman tax mechanisms, taking advantage of vacant or imperial lands. The Goths lived under their own customary law, while the Romans continued to be governed by Roman law. Intermarriage between Goths and Romans was generally discouraged, a policy that, while maintaining distinct identities, also limited the potential for social fusion. The administrative apparatus of the kingdom remained largely Roman. The Senate in Rome continued to function, its members holding prestigious, if somewhat diminished, roles. Roman civil servants, skilled in law and administration, continued to manage the bureaucracy, collect taxes, and maintain public works. Theodoric himself adopted many of the trappings of Roman imperial power, issuing coins with his own image, building magnificent structures, and patronizing arts and letters. His court in Ravenna became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars and artists. The Arian Christian Goths, followers of a branch of Christianity deemed heretical by the Nicene Christian Romans, were allowed to practice their faith freely, and Theodoric ensured religious tolerance, a remarkable stance for the era. He famously stated, "We cannot command religion because no one is forced to believe against his will." One of the most enduring symbols of Theodoric's reign is his mausoleum in Ravenna, a monumental structure that stands to this day. Its design, with a massive, single-piece stone dome, speaks to both Roman engineering prowess and a distinct Gothic aesthetic. It is a testament to his desire to create a lasting legacy, a fusion of styles that reflected his ambition for his kingdom. Other architectural projects included the rebuilding of walls, aqueducts, and public buildings, all contributing to a sense of renewed order and prosperity after decades of upheaval. Theodoric's foreign policy was equally ambitious. He forged a network of alliances with other Germanic kingdoms across Europe through strategic marriages, earning him the epithet King of the Goths and Germans. His daughters and nieces were married to the kings of the Franks, the Vandals, and the Burgundians, creating a fragile but extensive web of influence. He aimed to establish a new order in the West, one where Germanic kings, guided by Roman administrative principles, could coexist peacefully. This vision, however, was ultimately undermined by the inherent instability of the post-Roman world and the shifting loyalties of these nascent kingdoms. Despite his efforts to maintain peace and stability, Theodoric's later years were marked by growing tensions. The delicate balance between Goths and Romans began to fray. The Eastern Roman Empire, under the ambitious Emperor Justin I and his brilliant nephew Justinian, grew increasingly assertive, viewing Theodoric's independent kingdom with suspicion. Religious differences also became a flashpoint. The Eastern Empire, staunchly Nicene Christian, began to persecute Arians within its borders, which Theodoric, as an Arian, viewed as a direct affront. His rising pressure from Constantinople coincided with a growing paranoia within Theodoric's own court. He began to suspect plots and conspiracies among his Roman advisors, particularly those who maintained close ties with the Eastern Empire. The most tragic example of this was the execution of Boethius, a brilliant Roman philosopher, statesman, and scholar, around 524 CE. Boethius, who had served Theodoric faithfully, was accused of treason and imprisoned. During his captivity, he wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, a profound meditation on fate, free will, and divine providence. His execution, along with that of his father-in-law Symmachus, sent shockwaves through the Roman aristocracy and remains a dark stain in Theodoric's otherwise enlightened reign. Historians still debate the true extent of Boethius's guilt or innocence, with some suggesting he was a victim of political intrigue and Theodoric's increasing insecurity, while others point to evidence of genuine, if perhaps exaggerated, disloyalty. Theodoric died in 526 CE, leaving behind a complex legacy. He had ruled Italy for 33 years, bringing a period of peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing that was remarkable for its time. His attempt to fuse Roman and Gothic traditions to create a stable, bicultural kingdom was a bold experiment, yet his death unleashed the forces he had so carefully held in check. His grandson, Alaric, was too young to rule effectively, and the kingdom soon descended into factionalism and intrigue. Within a few years, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian launched his ambitious reconquest of the West, aiming to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. The Gothic Wars, which began in 535 CE, would rage for nearly 2 decades, devastating Italy and ultimately leading to the destruction of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The peninsula, once a jewel in Theodoric's crown, would be ravaged, its cities sacked, its population decimated. The dream of a harmonious Gothic Roman Italy, so carefully nurtured by Theodoric, dissolved into the smoke and ruin of war. The story of Theodoric the Great is a poignant reminder of the challenges inherent in forging new identities from old ones, of the delicate balance required to unite disparate peoples under a single crown. He was a king who walked between worlds, a barbarian who admired and sought to preserve Roman civilization, a warrior who yearned for peace. His achievements were immense, his vision grand, but ultimately the forces of history, driven by imperial ambition and cultural friction, proved too powerful to overcome. Yet for a brief, shining moment, Theodoric's Italy offered a glimpse of what might have been, a new European order, born not from destruction, but from a thoughtful, if ultimately tragic, attempt at synthesis. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars of a king who dared to dream of a unified realm, a legacy etched in the very stones of Ravenna, even as the tides of change relentlessly eroded his grand design. The whispers of the Ostrogothic kingdom, once so resonant across the Italian peninsula, began to falter as a new, formidable shadow stretched from the east. It was the shadow of Emperor Justinian I, a man whose ambition was as vast as the Mediterranean Sea itself, and whose vision was to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. From his resplendent court in Constantinople, Justinian looked west, seeing not a land lost, but a rightful inheritance, temporarily held by others. His gaze fell upon Italy, a land he believed was still Rome's, despite the Gothic kings who now ruled from Ravenna. Justinian's reign, beginning in 527 CE, marked a pivotal moment. He was a ruler of extraordinary intellect and tireless energy, a man who codified Roman law into the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis and built the magnificent Hagia Sophia, a testament to his imperial might and spiritual devotion. But his most enduring and perhaps most tragic ambition was the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the Roman Empire. For this grand design, Italy, the very heartland of the ancient empire, was indispensable. He saw the Ostrogoths not as legitimate rulers, but as usurpers, and their Arian Christianity as a heresy that further justified his intervention. The stage for this epic confrontation was set by internal strife within the Ostrogothic kingdom itself. After the death of the wise and powerful Theodoric the Great in 526 CE. The stability he had so carefully cultivated began to unravel. His grandson, Alaric, was still a child, and his mother, Amalasuntha, a woman of Roman education and sympathies, acted as regent. Her attempts to maintain peace with Constantinople and to educate Alaric in the Roman style were met with suspicion and resentment by many Gothic nobles, who feared the erosion of their traditions and power. This internal division was a crack that Justinian was quick to exploit. When Alaric died prematurely in 534 CE, Amalasuntha, seeking to secure her position and maintain the delicate balance, elevated her cousin Theodahad to co-ruler. It was a fatal miscalculation. Theodahad, a man of scholarly inclinations, but lacking in political acumen and military prowess, soon imprisoned, and then in 535 CE, had Amalasuntha murdered. This act, a brutal regicide, provided Justinian with the perfect pretext for intervention. He declared it an outrage, a violation of international law, and a personal affront. The reconquest of Italy, which he had long dreamed of, was now cloaked in the mantle of justice. In 535 CE, Justinian dispatched his most brilliant general, Belisarius, to Italy. Belisarius was a military genius. Fresh from his stunning victory over the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, a campaign that had taken little more than a year. He landed in Sicily, quickly securing the island, and then crossed into mainland Italy. The initial Byzantine advance was swift. Naples fell after a siege, and by December 536 CE, Belisarius marched into Rome itself, which had been abandoned by the Gothic garrison. The Eternal City, after decades under Gothic rule, was once again in the hands of an emperor who claimed to be its rightful heir. The Goths, under their new king Witigis, a general who had replaced the ineffectual Theodahad, were not easily broken. Witigis gathered a vast army and laid siege to Rome for over a year, from 537 to 538 CE. This siege was a brutal affair, marked by fierce fighting, daring sallies, and desperate privation within the city walls. Belisarius, with a much smaller force, masterfully defended the city, employing cunning tactics and exploiting Gothic weaknesses. He famously used the aqueducts not only for water, but also as a means of communication, and even as a defensive barrier. The Gothic attempts to storm the walls were repulsed time and again, often with heavy losses. The city's ancient structures, including the Mausoleum of Hadrian, were pressed into service as fortifications, their statues become improvised projectiles. The prolonged siege exhausted both sides, but it was the Goths who eventually broke, retreating north to Ravenna. Belisarius pursued them, and in 540 CE, after another lengthy siege, Ravenna, the Ostrogothic capital, fell. Witigis was captured and sent to Constantinople, along with much of the Gothic royal treasury. It seemed for a moment that Justinian's dream had been realized. Italy was reconquered, and the Gothic kingdom, to all appearances, had been shattered. However, the war was far from over. The Byzantine victory was incomplete, and the seeds of a new, even more devastating phase of conflict were already being sown. Justinian, perhaps overconfident, recalled Belisarius to the east to deal with the renewed Persian threat, leaving Italy under the command of less capable generals and with insufficient troops. The Goths, though defeated, were not entirely broken. They rallied under a new, charismatic leader named Totila, who emerged in 541 CE. Totila, whose original name was Baduila, proved to be an exceptional military commander and a shrewd politician. He understood the grievances of the Italian populace, who had suffered immensely under the Byzantine occupation, burdened by heavy taxes and often treated with disdain by the foreign administration. Totila skillfully exploited this discontent. He promised land and freedom to peasants and slaves who joined his cause, and he presented himself as a liberator from Byzantine oppression. His forces, initially small, grew rapidly. He systematically recaptured cities and fortresses across Italy, often by siege, but also through a policy of clemency towards those who surrendered, in stark contrast to the often harsh Byzantine treatment. By 546 CE, Totila had once again laid siege to Rome. This time, the city, poorly garrisoned and ravaged by plague and famine, fell after a betrayal. Totila, contemplating razing the city to the ground as a symbolic act, was persuaded by Belisarius, who had returned to Italy, though with limited resources, to spare it. He ordered the walls to be partially dismantled and then evacuated its remaining inhabitants, leaving Rome a desolate ghost town. The Gothic resurgence under Totila was a stunning reversal. Belisarius, despite his genius, was hampered by Justinian's reluctance to commit sufficient resources, his suspicions of his general's popularity, and the logistical challenges of fighting a protracted war across the sea. He managed to briefly recapture Rome in 547 CE, but it was a hollow victory, as Totila soon besieged and recaptured it again in 549 CE. The war dragged on, a grueling, attritional conflict that devastated Italy. The once fertile lands were laid waste. Cities were sacked multiple times, and the population plummeted due to famine, plague, and warfare. The economic and social fabric of the peninsula was utterly shredded. Historians still debate the true motivations behind Justinian's relentless pursuit of Italy. Was it a genuine desire to restore the Roman Empire for the good of its people, or was it a costly and ultimately unsustainable act of imperial hubris? Some argue that his focus on the West diverted crucial resources from the more pressing threat of the Sassanid Persians in the East, ultimately weakening the empire in the long run. Others contend that the Reconquest, however brutal, preserved a vital link to Rome's imperial heritage and prevented Italy from falling into complete fragmentation. The final act of the Gothic War came with the arrival of a new Byzantine general, Narses, in 551 CE. Narses, an elderly eunuch but a brilliant strategist and administrator, was given command of a large and well-equipped army, a testament to Justinian's unwavering determination. Unlike Belisarius, Narses was given the full backing of the imperial treasury. He marched his army overland around the Adriatic, avoiding the sea, and entered Italy from the northeast. In 552 CE, Narses confronted Totila's foe. Says at the Battle of Tagine in central Italy. It was a decisive engagement. Narses skillfully deployed his archers and dismounted cavalry using a crescent formation to envelop the Gothic charge. Totila himself was mortally wounded during the battle, a devastating blow to the Gothic cause. With their charismatic leader gone, the Goths rallied briefly under Teia, Totila's successor. But their fate was sealed. The last major Gothic stand occurred at the Battle of Mons Lactarius in 553 CE, near Naples. Here, the remaining Gothic warriors, fighting with desperate courage, were finally overwhelmed by Narses' superior forces. Teia was killed, and the remnants of the Ostrogothic army were either slain, captured, or dispersed into the mountainous regions, never again to form a coherent political or military force. The Gothic kingdom in Italy, which had endured for over half a century, was no more. The Byzantine reconquest, though successful in military terms, came at an immense cost. Italy was left in ruins. The war had lasted nearly 2 decades, from 535 to 553 CE, a period of unrelenting conflict that historians sometimes refer to as the Gothic Wars. The population of Italy, already weakened by earlier invasions and plagues, was decimated. The sophisticated infrastructure of Roman Italy, including its aqueducts, roads, and cities, suffered irreparable damage. The once vibrant urban centres dwindled, and the economy collapsed. The political landscape of Italy was also profoundly altered. The Ostrogothic kingdom, which had offered a degree of stability and a blend of Roman and Germanic traditions, was replaced by a Byzantine administration that struggled to maintain control over a devastated and rebellious populace. The Byzantine presence was often seen as foreign and oppressive, and their attempts to impose their own legal and religious systems were met with resistance. The long-term consequence of this brutal reconquest was not the restoration of a unified Roman Empire, but rather the fragmentation of Italy and its vulnerability to new invaders. Just a few years after the Byzantine victory, in 568 CE, another Germanic people, the Lombards, swept into Italy. They found a land so weakened and depopulated by Justinian's wars that they met little organized resistance. The Lombards quickly established their own kingdom in the north and central parts of the peninsula, further shattering any semblance of unified Roman rule. The Byzantine Empire retained control only over pockets of territory, primarily Ravenna, Rome, Naples, and parts of the south. This division of Italy into Lombard and Byzantine territories would endure for centuries, shaping the political geography of the peninsula well into the medieval period. The Goths themselves, as a distinct people in Italy, largely faded from the historical record after 553 CE. Some may have integrated into the local population, their Gothic language and customs gradually disappearing. Others likely fled north, seeking refuge in other Germanic lands. Their legacy, however, was not entirely erased. The Gothic presence in Italy had left its mark on architecture, law, and even language, though these influences are often subtle and difficult to trace definitively. The very idea of a Germanic kingdom ruling over a Roman populace and attempting to blend these two distinct cultures was a profound experiment in the post-Roman West, one that ultimately succumbed to the relentless ambition of an emperor who looked to the past rather than embracing the complex realities of his present. The Gothic decline, hastened by Justinian's ambition, ushered in an era of profound change and fragmentation for the Italian peninsula, a land that would not see true political unity again for over 1,000 years. The twilight of Roman power in Gaul had cast long shadows, but for the Visigoths, it was less an ending and more a dramatic relocation. Driven from their Aquitanian heartland by the Franks at the Battle of Vouillé on 507 CE, a significant portion of the Visigothic people, along with their king Alaric II, who fell in battle, retreated south across the Pyrenees. This was not a complete conquest, but a strategic withdrawal, leaving behind much of their Gallic territories but consolidating their hold on Hispania, a land they had already been intimately familiar with for decades. What began as a series of campaigns and settlements in the 5th century now solidified into a distinct Visigothic kingdom of Hispania, a realm that would endure for over 2 centuries, shaping the peninsula in profound and lasting ways. The landscape of Hispania, with its rugged mountains, fertile plains, and sun-drenched coastlines, offered a new stage for their evolving society. Unlike their earlier, more nomadic existence, or even their relatively brief tenure in Aquitaine, Hispania allowed for a deeper, more rooted development of their culture, laws, and religious identity. The initial decades were marked by a complex interplay of consolidation and conflict. The Suebi, another Germanic group, held sway in the northwest, while pockets of Roman influence, particularly in the southeast, clung on tenaciously. The Byzantines, under Emperor Justinian I, even launched a reconquest effort in the mid-6th century, establishing a province in the south known as Spania, which further complicated the political map. This patchwork of powers meant the Visigothic kings had to be both warriors and diplomats, constantly negotiating their authority. One of the most defining features of this new kingdom was its religious journey. The Visigoths, like many Germanic peoples, had adopted Arian Christianity, a doctrine that differed from the Nicene Catholic Christianity prevalent among the Hispano-Roman population. This religious divide was a constant source of tension and political maneuvering. The Arian kings often viewed the Catholic bishops with suspicion, seeing them as potential allies of the Byzantine Empire or as a subversive force within their own kingdom. However, over time, the advantages of religious unity became increasingly apparent. The conversion of King Recared I in 587 CE from Arianism to Nicene Christianity marked a pivotal moment. This wasn't merely a personal spiritual awakening, it was a profound political act. It paved the way for greater integration between the Visigothic elite and the Hispano-Roman majority, fostering a sense of shared identity that transcended ethnic lines. The Third Council of Toledo in 589 CE, where Recared formally announced his conversion, is a landmark event, solidifying the Catholic faith as the official religion of the Visigothic kingdom, and initiating a period of close cooperation between the monarchy and the church. This era also saw the flourishing of a unique legal system. Initially, the Visigoths maintained their own customary laws, while the Hispano-Romans continued to live under Roman law. This dual system, however, proved cumbersome and often led to conflicts. The desire for a unified legal code that would apply to all inhabitants, regardless of their ethnic origin, led to the creation of the Lex Visigothorum, or the Visigothic Code, sometimes known as the Forum Judicum or Liber Judiciorum. While earlier legal compilations existed, such as the Codex Euricianus from the 5th century and the Breviary of Alaric, Lex Romana Visigothorum, from the early 6th century, the Lex Visigothorum, finalized around the mid-7th century under King Requeswinth, was a truly groundbreaking achievement. It drew upon both Roman legal principles and Germanic traditions, creating a sophisticated and comprehensive body of law that addressed a wide range of issues, from property rights to marriage, from criminal offences to judicial procedures. This code was remarkable for its time, demonstrating a clear move towards a more centralized and equitable legal system, and it continued to influence legal thought in Hispania for centuries after the fall of the Visigothic kingdom. Historians still debate the precise extent to which this code was truly applied uniformly across all social strata, or if local customs still held significant sway in daily life. But its ambition and scope are undeniable. The Visigothic kings, now ruling a unified Catholic kingdom, increasingly adopted the trappings of Roman imperial power, even as they maintained their Germanic heritage. Toledo became the capital, a vibrant centre of political, religious, and intellectual life. The court fostered a blend of Roman and Germanic traditions, evident in their art, architecture, and even their coinage. The Visigothic period saw the construction of impressive churches, some of which still stand today, albeit often in ruins or heavily modified. These churches, with their distinctive horseshoe arches and intricate carvings, showcased a unique artistic style that blended late Roman and early medieval elements. The patronage of the church also led to a significant flourishing of intellectual activity. Figures like Isidore of Seville, a prolific scholar and bishop of the early 7th century, produced encyclopedic works that compiled vast amounts of knowledge from antiquity, preserving it for future generations. His Etymology, a monumental encyclopedia, became a standard textbook throughout the Middle Ages, demonstrating the intellectual vitality of Visigothic Hispania. Despite these advancements, the Visigothic kingdom was not without its internal struggles. The elective nature of the monarchy, where kings were chosen by a council of nobles and bishops rather than through hereditary succession, often led to instability. Ambitious nobles frequently vied for power, leading to assassinations, rebellions, and civil wars. The succession struggles were particularly acute in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, weakening the kingdom at a critical juncture. The kingdom's military strength, while sufficient to repel internal challenges and occasional external threats, was perhaps not as formidable as it once had been. The Visigothic army, composed of both Gothic and Hispano-Roman levies, relied on a mix of cavalry and infantry, but the constant internal strife likely diverted resources and attention from maintaining a strong defensive posture. Economically, Visigothic Hispania was largely agrarian, with a system of large estates worked by a combination of free peasants, coloni, semi-free tenants, and slaves. Trade, though diminished from Roman times, still connected the peninsula to the wider Mediterranean world. The kingdom also possessed rich mineral resources, particularly silver and gold, which were used to mint coins, reflecting a degree of economic stability. However, the overall prosperity of the kingdom ebbed and flowed with political stability and agricultural yields. The social structure was complex, with a distinct Visigothic aristocracy holding significant power and land, alongside the Hispano-Roman elite. The church also played a crucial role, with powerful bishops wielding both spiritual and temporal influence. Beneath these elites was the vast majority of the population, comprising free peasants, artisans, and a significant slave population. Though the institution of slavery was gradually evolving and in some cases softening under Christian influence, the integration of Goths and Romans was a gradual process, but by the 7th century, the distinctions were becoming increasingly blurred, with intermarriage and a shared cultural identity becoming more common. One lesser-known detail is that the Visigoths, despite their reputation as warriors, were also skilled artisans, particularly in metalwork. Exquisite examples of Visigothic fibulae, brooches, crowns, and other jewellery, often adorned with intricate cloisonné and precious stones, have been unearthed, showcasing a sophisticated artistic tradition that blended Germanic animal styles with Roman and Byzantine influences. These treasures, like the Guarazar hoard discovered in the 19th century, offer a tangible glimpse into the wealth and craftsmanship of the Visigothic court. Yet, as the 7th century drew to a close and the 8th century dawned, a new and unforeseen power was emerging from the east, one that would irrevocably alter the course of Hispania's history. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, in North Africa, the Umayyad Caliphate a rapidly expanding Islamic empire, had consolidated its control. Their gaze soon turned north, towards the fertile lands and perceived weaknesses of the Visigothic kingdom. The internal divisions and succession disputes that plagued the Visigoths in the early 8th century provided a critical opening. Legend, often intertwined with historical fact, speaks of a final, bitter struggle for the Visigothic throne between King Roderick and the sons of his predecessor, Witiza. This internal strife, whether real or exaggerated, undoubtedly weakened the kingdom's ability to present a united front against an external threat. In 711 CE, a relatively small but well-organized Muslim force, primarily composed of Berbers and Arabs, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The traditional account speaks of their landing at a rock that would forever bear Tariq's name, Jabal Tariq, or Gibraltar. The Visigothic king, Roderick, gathered his forces to meet the invaders, leading to the fateful Battle of Guadalete, likely fought near the Barbate River. The details of the battle are shrouded in the mists of time, with conflicting accounts from both Christian and Muslim sources. What is clear, however, is the devastating outcome for the Visigoths. King Roderick was defeated and likely perished in the battle. This single decisive engagement effectively shattered the Visigothic army, and with it, the centralized authority of the kingdom. The subsequent conquest of Hispania by the Umayyad forces was remarkably swift. Within a few years, most of the peninsula fell under Muslim control. The Visigothic cities, weakened by internal divisions and lacking a cohesive defense, often surrendered with minimal resistance, sometimes in exchange for favorable terms. The speed of the conquest has long puzzled historians. Was it the overwhelming military superiority of the invaders, or was it the deep-seated dissatisfaction of segments of the Hispano-Roman population with their Visigothic overlords, perhaps due to taxation or religious policies that led them to welcome or at least not actively resist the new rulers? Some scholars point to the significant Jewish population who had faced persecution under the later Visigothic kings as potentially viewing the Muslim invaders as liberators. The truth is likely a complex interplay of all these factors. The Visigothic kingdom, despite its long reign and cultural achievements, ultimately proved too fragile, too internally divided, to withstand the formidable challenge posed by the burgeoning Islamic empire. The fall of the Visigothic kingdom marked not just the end of a Germanic monarchy in Hispania, but the dawn of a new era, one that would profoundly reshape the cultural, religious, and political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula for centuries to come, creating Al-Andalus, a vibrant Islamic civilization that would leave an indelible mark on European history. The Visigothic legacy, however, did not entirely vanish. It subtly wove itself into the fabric of the new society, influencing legal traditions, architectural styles, and even the nascent Christian kingdoms that would eventually emerge from the northern mountains, beginning the long process of the Reconquista. The sun, in its slow, inevitable arc, continued to trace its path across the European sky, casting long shadows over the lands where Gothic kingdoms once flourished. With each passing century, the distinct lines that had once defined Goths as a separate people began to blur, softened by intermarriage, political alliances, and the inexorable march of cultural assimilation. The Visigoths in Hispania, after nearly 2 centuries of rule, found their kingdom increasingly integrated into the fabric of the Iberian Peninsula. Their legal codes, like the Lex Visigothorum, a sophisticated body of law that blended Roman tradition with Germanic custom, continued to shape jurisprudence long after their political dominance waned. This code, compiled and revised over generations, notably under King Reconquest in the 7th century, served as a foundational text for Spanish law, influencing legal thought for centuries and underscoring the Visigothic commitment to a structured society. Yet, even as their legal and administrative structures took root, the Visigothic identity itself began to dissolve into the broader Hispano-Roman populace. The final blow to their independent kingdom came not from within, but from across the Strait of Gibraltar. In 711 AD, a relatively small but determined force of Umayyad Muslims, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, landed on the Iberian Peninsula. The ensuing Battle of Guadalete saw the decisive defeat of King Roderick, the last Visigothic king. This event marked the end of the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania, initiating a new era of Islamic rule that would last for nearly 8 centuries. While the Goths as a ruling class vanished, their descendants and their cultural contributions were absorbed into the emerging tapestry of medieval Spain, their bloodlines mingling with those of the conquerors and the conquered alike. A similar, though perhaps more drawn-out, process unfolded in Italy for the Ostrogoths. After the Byzantine Reconquest under Justinian I in the mid-6th century, the Ostrogothic kingdom was shattered. Many Goths were killed in the protracted and devastating Gothic wars, while others were dispersed or integrated into the Byzantine administration. The remaining Goths, their numbers drastically reduced and their leadership fragmented, gradually lost their distinct ethnic identity. The arrival of the Lombards in Italy shortly after the Byzantine victory further complicated the demographic landscape, pushing the remnants of Ostrogothic culture further into the background. While the Lombards themselves would eventually be absorbed into the broader Italian identity, the Ostrogothic presence left a more ephemeral, though still discernible, mark on the region's cultural memory. The Burgundians, too, faced their own eventual absorption. After their kingdom in Gaul was conquered by the Franks in the early 6th century, they became subjects of the burgeoning Merovingian dynasty. While they initially retained some of their distinct laws and customs, the Frankish policy of integration, coupled with intermarriage and the gradual adoption of Frankish language and culture, led to their eventual assimilation. The region of Burgundy, however, retained its name, a lasting echo of the people who had once established a powerful kingdom there. This enduring place name, a testament to their historical presence, serves as a geographical marker of their legacy, even as the people themselves faded into the mists of time. It is in the realm of language that the Gothic legacy offers some of its most intriguing, if subtle, imprints. While Gothic itself, as a spoken language, largely disappeared by the 9th or 10th century, primarily surviving in isolated pockets like the Crimean Goths until much later, its influence on the developing Germanic languages was profound. The Gothic Bible, translated by Ulfilas in the 4th century, remains the most extensive surviving text in any East Germanic language. This monumental work, written in Ulfilas, its own invented alphabet, provides an invaluable window into a linguistic branch that otherwise would be largely lost to us. Scholars still debate the precise extent of Gothic's direct lexical influence on West Germanic languages, like Old English or Old High German, but its structural and phonological features certainly contributed to the broader evolution of the Germanic linguistic family tree. The very existence of such a comprehensive early Germanic text shaped subsequent philological studies and our understanding of language development in early medieval Europe. Beyond direct linguistic influence, the Gothic narrative contributed to the very concept of Germanic identity in later centuries. As various European nations began to forge their own national narratives in the early modern period, the Goths were often romanticized or appropriated. In Sweden, for instance, the Goths were claimed as ancestral heroes, their supposed origins in Scandinavia fueling a nationalist ideology known as Gothicism. This movement, prominent from the 16th to the 19th centuries, sought to establish Sweden as a powerful, ancient nation with a glorious martial past, directly descended from the formidable Goths who had once challenged Rome. While historically tenuous, this appropriation demonstrates the enduring power of the Gothic name and their association with strength and martial prowess. The artistic legacy of the Goths, though often overshadowed by their political and military history, also offers fascinating glimpses into their cultural identity. While much of their early art was perishable, consisting of textiles, wooden carvings, and metalwork, archaeological finds have revealed intricate brooches, buckles, and other ornaments, often adorned with zoomorphic designs and precious stones. These pieces, many found in burial sites, showcase a sophisticated craftsmanship and a distinct aesthetic that blended Roman, Sasanian, and steppe influences. The famous Sutton Hoo treasure, though often attributed to the Anglo-Saxons, displays stylistic similarities to Gothic metalwork, suggesting a shared artistic vocabulary across the Germanic world. The intricate garnet and gold cloisonné work found in these treasures speaks to a widespread taste for glittering, jewel-encrusted adornment that characterized the early medieval period. Perhaps one of the most enduring, yet often misunderstood, legacies of the Goths lies in their name itself. The term Gothic later became synonymous with a distinct architectural style that emerged in 12th century France, characterized by pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. This architectural movement, which swept across Europe, creating soaring cathedrals and intricate sculptures, initially bore the name Opus Frankigenum, or French work. It was during the Renaissance, in the 16th century, that Italian critics, seeking to disparage what they saw as the crude, barbaric art of the preceding centuries, compared to the classical ideals they championed, began to apply the label Gothic to this medieval style. For them, Gothic was a pejorative term, linking the perceived lack of classical refinement to the ancient destroyers of Rome. This historical irony is profound. A people who had long vanished from the political stage lent their name to one of Europe's most magnificent and enduring artistic achievements, albeit through a derogatory lens that was later reclaimed and celebrated. The echoes of the Goths also reverberate in the realm of literature and popular culture. From the 18th century Gothic novel, with its atmospheric castles, brooding heroes, and supernatural elements, to the modern Goth subculture, the term has taken on a life of its own, far removed from its historical origins. These later interpretations, while not directly tied to the historical Goths, draw on a romanticized or imagined sense of their past, a past associated with the dark, the mysterious, the ancient, and the powerful. The very idea of the barbarian as a force of nature, a destroyer of old orders and a harbinger of new ones, found a powerful archetype in the Goths. In the quiet dust of ancient battlefields, beneath the foundations of modern cities, and within the intricate patterns of legal codes, the story of the Goths continues to whisper. They were a people in constant motion, driven by a restless spirit and the shifting tides of empire. From the misty shores of the Baltic to the sun-drenched plains of Spain, they carved out kingdoms, forged alliances, and challenged the might of Rome. They left behind no single unified empire that endured for millennia, but rather a mosaic of influences, a scattered legacy woven into the very fabric of Europe. Their journey, marked by migration, conflict, and adaptation, is a testament to the dynamic and fluid nature of human history, where identities are forged, transformed, and ultimately absorbed, leaving behind only echoes in the grand tapestry of time. The distinct peoples known as the Goths may have ceased to exist as separate entities, but their impact, like the faint scent of an ancient forest after a rain, lingers on, a subtle yet undeniable presence in the cultural memory of a continent.